Okay, I think we can get started. Good afternoon. Or morning, or good day, wherever you happen to be today. I'm Fred Murphy. I work with the Marxist Education Project, and we're very pleased to welcome back Kevin Anderson to talk on the late Marx's Revolutionary Roads, his recently, actually almost just published book from Verso. Kevin's a good friend of the MEP. He's spoken at a number of our events over the years. He teaches at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he has been a scholar activist since the 1970s. He works in social and political theory, writing and teaching on Marx, Hegel, Lenin, Luxemburg, Marxist humanism, and the Frankfurt School. Among his numerous books are Lenin, Hegel, and Western Marxism, and Marx at the Margins on nationalism, ethnicity, and non-Western societies. I would say his new book is a sort of companion or sequel to that volume, which was very well received several years ago. Kevin is the co-editor with Peter Hudes of the Rosa Luxemburg Reader, and he writes regularly for New Politics, the International Marxist Humanist, LA Progressive, and Jacobin. Kevin's going to talk for maybe 35, 40 minutes about the book and his work, and at that point we will open the floor for questions and comments. So, Kevin, over to you.
Um, Thanks very much, Fred. It's good to be back. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. Actually, I've only been in Santa Barbara for 15 years. I was in Chicago for 25 years. And then, as anyone can tell, still, as soon as I open my mouth, I'm from the New York region and went to CUNY, actually, PhD. Uh, it's it's These are interesting and strange and scary times that we're in, and it might seem an escapism almost to be talking about what Marx wrote at the end of his life, but I think the opposite is true, which is that Marx was also living in a period of repression. The Paris Commune had been repressed and violently in 1871, and Marx was uh, very creatively looking around for what could be forms of what the mutations of capitalism and what we call today imperialism were, and also what the forces of resistance and revolution might be. So that's what my book and my presentation are about. People have asked me, well, let me do it a different way. I'm going to attempt to use a PowerPoint. So bear with me. Let's see if this works. Oh, okay, can you see that? Okay, wow. So it doesn't always work that well. Um, all right. So this is the title of my presentation. And if you want to be in touch with me, there's my email, but people know how to find people. Uh, First of all, this is the cover of the book. I'm just, it's just out. Um, I don't know if it's even that available in the United States yet, but it's becoming available. And I just wanted to first give you, if you haven't seen the book yet, this is the whole. This is the table of contents. And what I'll be talking about today is just the sixth chapter, which is not really a conclusion. And in a way, it's a conclusion in terms of what are some of the revolutionary concepts, or what are some of the strategies and concepts of revolution that Marx was arriving at late in his life. But the first five chapters are mainly about the research he was doing at the end of his life that made this possible. So it is a conclusion in that sense, but it doesn't. The book is really a deep dive into Marx's notebooks. There's a lot more on gender in the book itself than is going to appear in the presentation, just as one example. So, but let's get right to it. Oh, 1 second. Yeah. So I think in a place like MEP, people are aware of this, uh, that, well, they might not be aware that Marx discusses several types of revolutionary change, new types, somewhat different from what we see at the end of Capital. But I think most people would be familiar with these passages I'm about to quote from the historical tendency of capitalist accumulation, the second to the last chapter of the primitive accumulation section of Capital. And so Marx writes there about the centralization of capital, about the expropriation of the peasantry, what we call today dispossession, and also centralization in the sense that large capital is expropriating small capital. It doesn't have the word monopoly yet. I mean, he used it, but it's not used in the sense it was used later, uh, quite that precise way. But with that comes the growth of a large united working class. The capital itself creates the working class, unites it into these large industries and bodies of human beings. And there also grows the revolt of the class constantly increasing in numbers and trained, united, and organized by the very mechanism of the capitalist process of production. I think a lot of people know this. And then over time, the development, on the one hand, the productive forces, and the other hand, this increasingly united working class, all this becomes incompatible with their capitalist integument or shell. So we get the death knell of capitalist private property. The expropriators are expropriated, that is, the capitalist class, which had expropriated, stolen land and labor power over the centuries, is itself expropriated by a mass revolution, which he calls a nod to Hegel in the dialectic of the negation of the negation. So I think people know about this. Sociologists have been for 100 years saying it's untrue, both because the working class isn't really united that way, and also the implicit prediction that this is going to happen sooner rather than later, and so on. I think we all know that those arguments too. But what I want to bring out is that this is rigorously dialectical, obviously, in the sense that new developments, new concentrations of power and wealth create new contradictions. In this case, a main contradiction, the united working class. But it's certainly here from a contemporary radical perspective, including a lot of the non-Marxist critics of Marx, but also within Marxism too. It does not deal with race, colonialism, gender, the state, or other concrete factors. And these are, in fact, discussed in some of Marx's other writings, and especially in his late, largely unpublished ones. I don't mean that the main outline isn't there in publications, but to really get a sense of how important it was to him, we have to look at these unpublished writings, and there's certain pathways and streams that are not in the published writings. So this is what I want to focus on today. Three streams that they don't replace, in my view, the theory of revolution in I just outlined, but they supplement it or they exist alongside it. One, race, class, and nationalism and revolution in Ireland and Europe. This is a framework carried over from his earlier writings in the 1860s on the U.S. Civil War. Explicitly anti-statist conceptions of communism in the Paris Commune of 1871. On these Ireland writings around 1870. Paris Commune 1871. And three, the pre-capitalist indigenous clan and village commune as a base of resistance to capital in Russia and beyond. This is 1877, but mainly 1879 to 82. I say 82, although Marx died in 1883 because there's no actual writings in 1883. He died in March and he was pretty debilitated. In each case, Marx revised his earlier views, and in the first two, he actually says so, that I have revised it. Okay, so number one, this is the one where probably, well, I don't know how familiar people are. Ireland and the specificity of ethnicity, nationalism, colonialism, and class in the context of the wider European Revolution. Because already in Capital, this is there from the first editions of it in 1867, Ireland is seen as the victim of a particularly capitalist form of colonialism with very bitter class conflicts between often British landlords and Irish peasants, which threatened to weaken Britain as a world power. And in Marx, in his lifetime, especially in the 1850s and 60s, the two colonial societies he concentrated on the most, and which the European socialist movement did as well, were Ireland and Poland. But of course, they're different. Ireland is colonized by the most technologically advanced industrial society, and Poland by a society that was less technologically advanced than itself, agrarian Russia. And a couple other countries too, but mainly Russia. Most of its territory is occupied by Russia. And Marx's opposition to the Russian Tsarist regime and its form of utterly reactionary imperialism was a lodestar for his entire life, as was his unstinting support for Polish national liberation from Tsarist colonial domination. And this was really a theme of his whole generation, very, very strongly. The Irish thing was a little more concentrated on the very western fringes of Europe, but every socialist in Europe had to have a position on Poland, and the vast majority, with the exception of Pierre Proudhon, were very supportive of Poland. Now, when I finished Marx at the Margins 25 years ago, or 15 years ago, this seemed a little dated. It didn't seem to have like a direct connection. But what we've had since then is, on the one hand, the invasion of Ukraine, but on the other hand, and more interesting in terms of Marx's writings specifically, is this post-Soviet form of Russian imperialism that based its ideological claims increasingly on the messianic Slavophile and right-wing Christian ideology that undergirded Tsarism, as we can see in the actual writings about Ukraine, and we can see in Putin's speeches. So kind of comes alive, and I think it's interesting to remember that Marx saw this kind of ideology as the most reactionary of any in the world at the time. Okay, but going back to Ireland, 1869-70 is the crucial period, the winter, November through about January. This is right after the German edition of Capital, 1867, and he works out a theory of revolution concerning Ireland and Britain that intertwined peasant and worker, landlord and capitalist. I'm just going to mention it in kind of point fashion. Anti-Irish prejudice weakens and divides the British working class. 2, super oppression of the Irish peasant could spark an agrarian revolution that spilled over into Britain, the center of global capitalism, in conjunction with a revolutionary outbreak on the continent, probably in France. And of course, he writes this a little over a year before the outbreak of the Paris Commune. He connects it in turn to Marx's writings. He connects it to his writings a few years earlier in the Civil War in the United States. And if you recall, there's a lot of other writings, but even in Capital, there's this sentence or a couple sentences that in the United States, every independent workers' movement was paralyzed as long as slavery disfigured a part of the republic. Then the off-quoted sentence that labor in a white skin cannot emancipate itself where it is branded in a black skin. But then quickly, not seeing that as some kind of permanent thing blocking revolution, but a new life immediately arose with the death of slavery. The first fruit of the American Civil War was the 8 Hours agitation, which ran from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and he also mentions the founding of the National Labor Union in 1866. Going back to Ireland, in an 1870 statement of the First International, his name is not on it. It's a collective statement, but he pretty obviously is the author of it. He writes that in normal times, the presence in England of Irish workers and the quasi-racist antagonism they face in their English co-workers serves to strengthen and even stabilize the rule of capital. The English bourgeoisie has not only exploited Irish poverty and suffering. Oh, and I played around with the translation, and like so many things, Marx actually writes this in French, which was an international language at the time. Uh, well, it is today, I guess, too, but much more so then. Uh, Irish poverty and suffering to keep down the working class in England by forced immigration of impoverished Irishmen, but it has also divided the proletariat into two hostile camps. In all the big industrial centers in England, there is profound antagonism between the Irish proletarian and the English proletarian. The common English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers wages and the standard of life. But then he adds to this a comparison to white racism inside the U.S. popular classes. He, the English worker, feels national and religious antagonism toward him, the Irish worker. He views him similarly to how the poor whites of the southern states of North America viewed the black slaves. Strikingly, in his 1879 notes on ancient Rome, Marx similarly characterizes the free but impoverished plebeians who failed to unite with the enslaved population even when their revolts were contemporaneous, because they were, especially in the 130s and 120s BC, you had both huge plebeian and revolts and huge slave uprisings in the Roman sphere. So here's what Marx writes in his notes on Rome that haven't been published yet except in German. Political struggle only on the part of the poor whites of the proletarians. In Athens and Rome, they attempted to humor them, providing them with cheap food and entertainment. The poor whites, he's not arguing that there's a racial component to plebeians, the plebeians' prejudices toward the slaves, but what he's saying is that it's analogous. That they probably felt they had a different status. Also, the slaves were foreigners for the most part, and so on. So this they had this attitude similar to that of the poor whites in the South. Thus, in three different contexts, England, Ireland, the U.S., and Rome, it was not only an issue of unite and fight among the various wings of the oppressed classes, but also one where the higher status part of the popular classes would have needed to really acknowledge the vastly worse position of those more subordinated and scorned, and most importantly, their humanity. And then back to Ireland in particular, there's also the statement that this is a change of position, and it concerns what I'm going to call the directionality of revolution. For a long time, I believed it would be possible to overthrow the Irish regime by English working class ascendancy. That's what he meant, that the English would, there'd be a revolution in England, that would spread over, they'd liberate the colonies, including Ireland, and then that would be how Ireland would be liberated. I always took this viewpoint in the New York Tribune, talking about the 1850s. Deeper study has now convinced me of the opposite. The English working class will never accomplish anything before it has got rid of Ireland. The lever must be applied in Ireland. This is why the Irish question is so important for the social movement in general. It is important to note that Marx is turning all this around dialectically, now seeing the Irish as source of revolutionary inspiration, something that will spread across the Irish Sea with the help of his First International's influence over the British trade unions. It is therefore by no means, in no way, a writing off of the English working class as irrevocably lost to the class struggle. Recall in this context that only a few years earlier, during the Civil War in the U.S., Marx had praised to the skies the internationalist stance of the English workers who continued their anti-slavery and pro-North meetings in the face of both economic deprivation and calls by members of the dominant classes to support their idea of siding with the South and breaking the northern blockade of the ports to get the cotton flowing back to Manchester. Thus, he was not giving up on the English workers. So in the Ireland writings, I believe we have a complex dialectic of revolution which recognizes nations and ethnic sectors, which is truly international, and which sees the revolution in a many-sided manner. Summing up, one, France will probably spark the European Revolution, but unlike Britain, it is too underdeveloped economically to have a large enough working class and to win out against global capitalism. Two, Irish peasants will also step in at the beginning, challenging both landlordism and colonialism in their pro-independence and anti-landlord struggle. Three, this will weaken the position of the British ruling classes since landlords stand alongside capitalists as one of the two major wings of the ruling classes. Moreover, the sons of aristocratic landlords dominate the officer corps of the military, part of the hardcore of the state. Four, in England, the power of the country's burgeoning trade union movement is attenuated by the fact that English workers, in quasi-racist fashion, similar to the attitude of poor whites to formerly enslaved blacks in the southern U.S., despise the sub-proletariat of Irish immigrant workers. Revolution in Britain is impossible until this is overcome. Five, as the Irish struggle spills over into Britain and with the help of agitation by the International in favor of Ireland and for class solidarity across the Irish-English divide inside Britain, the dialectics of revolution will kick in as the conscience of English workers will undergo a radical transformation, giving them a greater sense of solidarity with their Irish counterparts and therefore making them more amenable to revolution. Thus, both materially and ideologically, an Irish social revolution will be the lever, as he calls it, he uses that explicit language, that pries open the British and wider European one, which will probably begin in France. Okay, second part, much briefer, on the anti-statist revolution alongside the anti-capitalist one. In the Civil War in France, published in 1871, again written anonymously, what we now know written by Marx, he attacks the state as well as capital in what was published as an address of the First International on the Paris Commune. As the Commune practiced it, a modern social republic of the working class needed to abolish the standing army of the police, note that, abolition of the police already, and other organs of state repression, substituting a direct proletarian democracy based upon an armed citizenry. And one of the famous lines is, but the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. And he does mention gender here. He singles out as heroic the real women of Paris who assumed their part in the Civil War, something he did not do in his writings on the 1848-49 revolution. A year later, Marx also indicates that the Commune had caused him to change his position on the state compared to that articulated in the Communist Manifesto. Thus, in an 1872 preface to a new edition of the Manifesto, he and Engels wrote of several aspects that had become outdated. One of these outdated features was, quote, the revolutionary measures proposed at the end of Section 2. They don't specify, but in 1848 these included centralization of credit in the hands of the state and centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Referring to the Paris Commune, they do, in their preface, they continue, referring to the Paris Commune where the proletariat for the first time held political power, they write, one thing was especially proved by the Commune, viz. That the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and read it, wield it for its own purposes. Okay, so that's a clear statement of a change of position. 3, communal villages as loci of revolution in Russia and beyond. In his last years, I really should have written 1877 to 82, Marx places Russia at the forefront of European revolution, as seen in this letter to the French socialist Jules Guetta of May 10, 1879. And this letter has actually surfaced only in the last year or two in the papers of Guetta in the French archives. One, I'm convinced that the explosion of the revolution will begin this time not in the West but in the Orient, in Russia. Russia is considered part of the Orient in this context. It is of the highest importance that at the moment of this general crisis in Europe, we find the French proletariat already having been organized into a workers' party and ready to play its role. As to England, the material elements for its social transformation are superabundant, but a driving spirit is lacking. It will not form up except under the impact of explosion of events on the continent. This shows Marx's view of the directionality of revolution, seeing it as beginning in Russia, but it does not include his research on indigenous and agrarian communisms as sources of revolution, apparently begun later that same year. So let's take a look at that. Okay, in his last years, and now narrowing it to 1879 to 82, Marx does refer to that research in letters to Russian revolutionaries and in draft material to communal social forms in Russian villages and to the possibility of avoiding capitalism there. Especially, this is the case in an 1881 letter to Vera Zazulich and material he drafted for that letter. These writings on Russia are just the tip of the iceberg, however, as they were the most visible part of a vast project in which Marx made hundreds of thousands of words of notes in 1879-82 on anthropological and social history studies of the long list: India, Indonesia, North Africa, pre-colonial and colonial Latin America, Russia, ancient Rome, pre-colonial Ireland, medieval Europe, and a variety of pre-literate societies, from the indigenous clans of the Americas to the Homeric Greeks, as well as physical anthropology and paleontology. These notes also deal extensively with gender, especially concerning Greece, Rome, and the indigenous peoples of the Americas and Ireland as well. Now, in those drafts to that letter for Zazulich, there are statements like this: Russia is the only European country in which the agricultural commune has maintained itself on a national scale up to the present. It is not, like the East Indies, the prey of a conquering foreign power. On the one hand, communal land ownership allows it directly and gradually to transform fragmented individualist agriculture into collective agriculture, and the Russian peasants already practice it on the undivided prairies. The physical configuration of the land makes it suitable for large-scale mechanized cultivation. The peasant's familiarity with the artel relationship can help him to make the transition from labor on particular parcels to cooperative labor. And finally, Russian society, which has for so long lived at his expense, owes him the credits required for such a transition. In this period, Marx was extensively researching communal social formations, like he was talking about there, not only in Russia, but also in British-ruled India and French-ruled Algeria as well, also noting anti-colonial unrest in those societies. I mean, these are just examples. I'm going to go into all this stuff at great length in the book. In a letter a few weeks before that to Zazulich, he writes of a potential uprising in India. This is early 1881. In India, serious complications, if not a general outbreak, is in store for the British government. What the English take from them annually in the form of rent, this is a bleeding process with a vengeance. The famine years are pressing each other, and in dimensions till now not yet suspected in Europe, there is an actual conspiracy going on wherein Hindus and Muslims cooperate. Similarly, in his 1879 notes in Algeria, Marx mentions the determined effort in the settler colony to destroy the communal village structures among the peasants, which are the strongest social base for resistance. Marx also notes that this crackdown in Algerian communes is occurring simultaneously with that on the working class communism of the Paris Commune of 1871, part of a generalized fear and repression of communism on the part of the ruling classes. But it is again in his discussions of Russia that Marx explicitly links rural communal social formations to a modern communist revolution, not just as in the letter a couple years ago that the revolution is going to start in Russia, but could a communist revolution start in Russia? Something a little more, obviously a lot more radical. This is theorized in his last published writing. I don't know if people realize this is Marx's last publication. A new preface co-authored with Engels to the 1882 Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto. So here's the key sentence in terms of the issues I'm discussing here. If the Russian Revolution becomes the signal for a proletarian revolution in the West so that the two complement each other, then Russia's peasant communal land ownership may serve as the point of departure for a communist development. Just look at that for a second. There's communal land ownership. There's proletarian revolution possibly in the West, which occurred fairly recently in the Paris Commune. There's a connection there, but the connection is not just as in that letter I quoted a little while ago, the revolutionary is going to start in Russia, but the Russian peasant communal land ownership may serve as the point of departure for a communist development. certainly in Russia, but I think he's saying the communist revolution, the Europe-wide communist revolution from Ireland to Russia could start in Russia, in fact, is likely to start in Russia in this period as he's reading events, and that it's not just the energy of it or the size of Russia, but it's the fact that there's indigenous communism in the Russian villages. So, what then are some of the new forms of revolution that could have been conceptualized on the basis of Marx's research on indigenous and rural communism? These are not instead of, but alongside or preceding and sparking what he conceptualized as a working class revolution as outlined at the end of Capital Volume 1, thing with which I began. Oh, just saw that. Wait a second. Then I opened the slide. 1 second. Yeah, there is a button to push it. I can't figure that out. I'm very sorry about that. That it's not as readable. Okay, so what are these are 6 new notions of revolution. He didn't make all these explicit, but I think one can, these could have been developed out of the research that he was doing at the end of his life this last, especially these last 4 or 5 years. Now, the one he is explicit, let's start with the one I just mentioned, as he states explicitly in the preface to the Manifesto of 1882, resistance on the part of Russia's communal villages to capitalist encroachment could form the point of departure for a European revolution if it also involved the Western proletariat. 2. In his notes on Algeria's communal villages and their resistance to French imperialism, Marx connects the fear of the French ruling classes over this resistance to their fear of the Paris Commune that broke out under their very noses. A similar Arab village communal system persists in Gaza and the rest of Palestine even today, according to a recent article by the historian Peter Linebaugh, who found evidence of this in British colonial reports of about 100 years ago and complaining about the difficulty this was giving them in dominating historic Palestine. 3. In his notes on Ireland, Rome, and Native Americans, he frequently notes the social power women held in the days before colonialism. This too was a locus of resistance, and remnants of these forms existed most crucially in Ireland. 4. In his extensive notes on India, and frankly, in terms of numbers of pages, India is by far the society he devotes the most attention to in the last few years of his life. In his extensive notes on India, he writes that a communal social structure underlay the uprising led by Maratha rebel Shivaji against the Mughal Empire. He also singles out women's leadership during the Sepoy uprising of 1857-59. 5. In his notes on pre-colonial and colonial Latin America, Marx singles out the persistence of indigenous communal social structures even after the establishment of Spanish colonialism. Such communal societies in which women were prominent were much more resilient and sustainable than modern capitalism. And he also suggests that in terms of the persistence of these forms, even after capitalism of a sort is introduced by the Spanish, is that the Spanish colonialism was at a much lower level of economic development, and so therefore it wasn't able to uproot these structures as fully as what the British attempted in India. But even there in India, he thinks there is persistence. 6. In his 1881 notes on communal and clan structures in pre-colonial Ireland, and these are just after the letter to Zazulich that he completes these notes, Marx emphasizes the persistence of these social forms right up through his own time, also singling out the social power women held in the days before the British conquest and their colonialism. This would impact his theorization of resistance to colonialism and landlordism as first developed in his 1870 theorization of Ireland and the wider revolution. Okay, so conclusion, 3 new concepts of revolution alongside that of a united working class uprising. 1, British workers' revolution sparked by revolt in France and an agrarian national revolution in Ireland, which would shake up the racialized false consciousness of British workers and unite them with their immigrant Irish co-workers. 2. Revolution inside a modern capitalist society that targets and abolishes the modern centralized state with an emancipatory alternative, as in the Paris Commune, as a prerequisite for the abolition of capitalism itself. 3. Revolution beginning in non-capitalist agrarian societies like Russia, with communal village or indigenous communist systems, which in resisting capitalist encroachments would also connect to the revolutionary labor movement in the technologically more developed world. Thank you. Hello.
Kevin, thank you very much. I found that mind expanding. It's a whole lot of stuff that we were some of us were sort of vaguely aware of, but the way you put it all together is really really important. And I hope this book gets really a wide reading and discussion. So the floor is open for anyone who'd like to ask questions of Kevin or comment on the presentation. Just ask you to keep your remarks relatively brief so everyone can speak. And you can either put your self in the speaker stack by writing the word stack in the Zoom chat, or use the React raise hand feature in your Zoom window down at the bottom. Or failing all of those, you can wave vigorously and I will try to recognize you. Leonard, go ahead.
Hey, wait, I'm just going to turn my camera on so this doesn't feel so impersonal. Hey, thank you so much, Kevin. I was just wondering kind of how this research that you've been doing for this book and the previous one, how that has, how you kind of view the received view of Marx's conception of revolution in light of these findings, especially kind of the what you were just telling us about his analysis of Russia. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought of it in terms of three possible attitudes. One is what some people have said, starting with Theodor Shanin in that famous book, Marx on the Russian Road, published about 40 years ago. They see a break. There's a certain number of people who just see a break that after capital, this is Marx after capital, and the ones that stress that often say it's like a better Marx. So it's kind of paralleled the way some people try to see a break between the late Marx, between the young Marx and the Marx of Capital and Communist Manifesto and Grundrisse. I'm not going to mention any names, but there's a guy whose name begins with the same letter as my last name. He's known for that. So that's one way. A second way is to just say, well, Marx is really great. He kept tweaking things. He was always great. He's creative. And then the third one is what I've tried to use, which is that there's an evolution. I started this with the Marx at the Margin, saying, the Communist Manifesto is, if you want to criticize the Marx for being Eurocentric and tacitly supporting colonialism, Communist Manifesto is the worst in the sense they say break down these Chinese laws and so on. Even by the notorious 1853 writings in India, which Edward Said attacks him over, there also is discussion there of the horrors of colonialism, and there are even passages saying India needs to obtain its independence, and so forth. And then by the time of the uprisings of the Second Opium War and the uprisings of 1857 in India, you get an explicitly anti-colonial position by Marx and Engels. But what shifts in the late period is that, I mean, there's a sentence by Marx in 1858 where he writes to Engels, the Indians are our best allies in the midst of this uprising in India. But at that time, I've never seen any traces that Marx thinks the social system the Indian rebels or the Chinese rebels are fighting for is something we can support as communists. The shift that occurs in the 1870s and 80s is that he starts to see like true allies, not just as a rhetorical flourish, but true allies that also have communist aims, although they may be like based on some traditional social forms. And of course, the other thing that shifts dramatically by that point is any notion that all societies have to go through capitalism, have its peasantry dispossessed or its indigenous societies eradicated, and then move to communism on the basis of a modern working class. So that's the only way to do it. So that famous or infamous stage theory. So there, this obviously is something that I've thought about a lot, and one thing I try to resist is, because a lot of people read those Irish writings and they say, oh yeah, well, like these white workers, like they're like racists, you know, kind of. Marx knew that too. Wow, that's really good. But that's not Marx's point. His point is the opposite. His point is how are we gonna stir this thing up? He sees it as probably inevitable that there's going to be a working class revolution in Britain. It's just that how can we stop us from being slowed down? That's the way he's looking at it. He continues to have tremendous confidence in the long-term possibilities of the proletariat, but he doesn't paint it in rosy colored glasses.
Okay, I have a question if no one else is going to go. We here at the Marxist Education Project have been running a long-term study group on forms of resistance and struggle against fascism and repression in the United States. And at present, we're making our way through Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. So I'm curious if you found any awareness or commentary in Marx's notebooks or correspondence on the intense class struggles that were unfolding in the U.S. South during Reconstruction. You talked about his comparison of the poor whites of the South vis-a-vis the freed people to the attitudes of the English workers to the Irish workers. But there's another dimension of that Du Bois stresses, which is basically the failure of Northern workers and the organized, such that there was an organized labor movement in the U.S. North in the period after the Civil War, their failure to embrace freedom and justice for the Southern freedmen. And that was really, Du Bois sees that as the great tragedy of American history, really, the failure of these two, what he calls proletarian movements, to link up and to solidarize with each other and to struggle together after the Civil War. So all that was going on in North America, but Marx seems to have been a little bit focused on other matters at that point. But I'm just curious to see if it comes up at all in his later work.
Yeah, it is, but it's very occasional, like in that thing I wrote about, that quote about Ireland, or the thing about Rome, which is probably a little later in 1879, comparing the plebeian attitude toward the poor whites. No, he doesn't. There's no long discussion of Reconstruction by Marx that I'm aware of. Of course, we could read the Irish stuff. I mean, the Ireland writings are where he really puts together that kind of question you just talked about. Is how do we unite these very different, in some ways, groups of the oppressed, and seeing the division between them as a huge obstacle toward any kind of progress, let alone revolution. So it's not. it's not there. Du Bois, of course, is aware of what Marx did write, except for this very long out of print thing. I think it was published in 1904, something like that. Schutte published an American socialist. He published a collection that included some of Marx's writings on the Civil War, some of these writings on race and class. But at the height of segregation, Schutte, this northern immigrant socialist, he said, "Wow, wasn't this great? Now blacks are like free and have voting rights." I don't know what world he was living in. But Du Bois picks it up because Black Reconstruction is 1935, and Du Bois quotes several things there, including the one that didn't make it into the collected works, or Marx and Engels on the Civil War in the United States, which is this communication for about 1865, not letter to Lincoln, but letter to the American people, which is unsigned, but probably written by Marx, or certainly someone who thought like Marx, which is saying, unless you go forward with full citizenship rights, you're going to have a second Civil War in the United States. So Du Bois actually quotes that, quoting it from German, retranslating it from German into English, because Schutte someone was retranslating some of it from German. So because Du Bois's thing is 1935, I think, that first collection by the Communist Party, Marx and Engels on the Civil War in the United States, I think 1937 or 38. So Du Bois in a sense builds his book around, or to some extent, around what Marx was writing on the Civil War, which very few Marxists were aware of at the time. Certainly American Marxists were unaware of it. So the dialogue is in that direction. But no, Marx didn't. He didn't. Because one last thing, I think this new book by August Nimtz, and there's a co-author, his name I'm blanking on, this exhaustive book on Frederick Douglass, Karl Marx, and the Civil War. That's the most detailed thing we've ever gotten on Marx and the Civil War. He makes the argument. I mean, I already say it in Marx at the Margins, but I didn't emphasize it as much. This is really a revolution. Marx sees the Civil War not just as a revolution, but as a social revolution, because it abolished property relations. The 4 million enslaved people who were freed without compensation was a huge confiscation of private property, in addition to all, at a human level, the much more important things that comes for those people. But so what is this then? In Marx's own lifetime, there are 3 revolutions that he witnesses, that he's aware of, very aware of, or in fact participates in. 1848 to 49, actual participant, theorist of. The Civil War in the United States, theorist of from afar, and then the Paris Commune, theorist of from afar. Of these revolutions, which was the biggest and most important in terms of its global impact? The Civil War in the United States, unquestionably. First of all, it was a partial victory, unlike the other 2. But also its economic consequences were so much greater. So this is the greatest revolution of Marx's lifetime. So even if he didn't return to Reconstruction, as much as maybe we wish he had, and we have to work that out ourselves, there's a lot in there that we can look at that can help us figure that out. And I think Du Bois was already doing that. And Du Bois's book has obviously it's a hugely great work of research. But I think one area where Du Bois and Marx would have disagreed a little bit, which is the talented 10th theory, which you can still see even in some parts of Black Reconstruction, which is, in my opinion, Du Bois's greatest book. Because Marx had more of a sense. I mean, not that he would deny the importance of leadership or organization, but the most radical social changes come from below.
Okay, thanks. That's quite interesting. There's a couple of questions been presented in the chat, and I just wondered if Karen or Shan want to actually, raise your questions directly, or shall I just read them? I can just read them. And then Steve is also on Stack. So Karen asks, does Marx have any critiques of the state in a proletarian revolution after writing The Civil War in France? Could you share some of those critiques if there are any?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, and I do discuss it in my book, but I just cut that short, in this presentation. The critique of the Gotha program,
Yeah.
1875. I mean, it's known as the place where Marx discusses communism in some detail and the two phases of communism. But one thing that runs throughout that, he's attacking the Lassallean socialists, and there's 10 or 12 places where he says what's wrong with them is they want to strengthen the state, or they want the workers to use the state, and this kind of thing. So anti-statism runs throughout. And if I can just give a plug, the new translation that Carol Ludenhoff and I did, which is actually a revision of an earlier translation that's been around for a while, but we went through the whole thing very carefully, and we found that one significant place where all the translations have made it sound like Marx supports the state, where it was the functions of the state, healthcare presumably, and things like that he was supporting to continue under communism. So yeah, there is. That's the obvious example, but people like Kohei Sato in this new book on the two new books on Marx, late Marx and the environment and climate and ecology, I think correctly he sees a lot of this discussion of these indigenous and communal societies as in part about communism. These are, well, if it's the Native Americans, they're stateless. Leaving aside the ones like the Aztecs, but the ones in what's today the United States were stateless for the most part. And then these Russian villages and the like, obviously it's the state over them, but the inner political system has germs of a stateless society in it as well. So I would say that's something that both implicitly and explicitly he continues to discuss. And maybe this interest in communes, maybe he gets interested in that because of the Paris Commune. In a positive sense, he definitely gets interested in looking at India and some of these other places because it isn't just in France that the working class movement is defeated. It's throughout Europe. The 1870s is a period of reaction. And so he's looking around, casting around for allies and other sources of revolution and rebellion. So in that sense, too.
Okay, Shan, did you want to present your question, or go ahead?
Hi, thank you for the lecture, and I really appreciate that you bring the importance work of late Marx, particularly which is very relevant for today. I have a question that related to the second chapter of your book, which was not covered in today's lecture. I'm very curious about the title, the temporalities and geographies of gender kinship and women's empowerment. And I'm wondering if you can briefly introduce your study of Marx's notes concerning gender. I noticed that you particularly compared to Engels' book about origins of family. So if you can, on this platform, I would like to know more about this part. Thank you.
Sure. You haven't read it yourself yet, though, right? The chapter.
Oh, I love that part. Read a part of that.
Oh, so you read the chapter.
It's already available on Amazon. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So, I just try to survey it. I mean, I start with origin of the family and Engels, and there's some critiques that could be made. The way Engels approaches it, we now have Marx's own notebooks on which Marx was basing his study, Marx notes on Morgan. So I look at some of those differences and then go straight into Marx. And then I also look at something that Morgan and Engels discuss too, which is ancient Rome and Greece. But there's other notes on Rome that were made in 1879. I take up those as well. And then I I I take up a couple other societies in which Marx discusses gender in his notes. The Paris Commune, Algeria, and Ireland. No, yeah, India and Ireland. Uh, so I try to look at it not just through these ethnological notebooks, narrowly conceived, but just everything Marx was writing in the last years of his life. And I was surprised myself that what I said before, that I never thought about it because I've read a lot of Marx's writings on the 1848 revolutions, and I've never seen any particular mention of women, although we know that women were very prominent in that revolution. But in the Paris Commune, in those writings, he does single out women explicitly at several junctures. And then, so I wanted to look at it thematically throughout the whole of these late writings. But of course, the most attention is given to these indigenous communal societies, like the Iroquois, where Marx was, and Engels also were very taken with the relative degree of gender equality in these societies as opposed to modern capitalism. But there's two big differences with Engels that I argue are, and there's other scholars. I mean, this started with my mentor, Raya Denievskaya. We've had feminist scholars like Heather Brown has a whole book which has 2 chapters on this stuff, Marx and gender in the family, and then Emmanuel Conversano and in Italy and Mela Yaman in Turkey have written on this lately too. So, what are the two big differences that we've been pointing to? One is that there's an idealization of the pre-state societies in Engels, and more especially Engels and a little bit Morgan. And the actual evidence Morgan is presenting shows that, well, it wasn't full equality. Like, it was a little bit like the Romans in the sense that the tribunes of the people could meet, but they couldn't talk. They could just like vote in this yes or no in a plebiscitary fashion. So the Iroquois women could present their view to the council, but they couldn't speak or something like that. But the bigger one and more important one is that the Romans pretty clearly were not as sexist as the Greeks. If you read Aristotle, I mean, it sounds a little like Saudi Arabia in terms of what he thinks. Women shouldn't go on the street without a guardian or whatever, or respectable women anyway. But with the Romans, the Roman authors are full of complaints about the women going into the streets and being loud and making trouble, and they didn't serve in the Senate or anything like that, but they had more rights than under the Greeks. So Marx sees ups and downs. So I don't think Marx would have agreed with the notion of a world historical defeat of the female sex, starting with the beginning of patriarchy and class societies. Well, what now? I think Engels was saying about 7,000 years ago. Not because horrible things didn't seem to have happened to women, and patriarchy didn't arise at that time. That's true, probably. But it's just that it wasn't unbroken domination of thousands and thousands of years. And so I think that's, and there's lots of stuff we can look at in terms of the past to show that, and it's important to look at that.
Okay, Steve Backman has had his hand up for a while. Steve, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. And also my thanks for a wonderful talk. I'm looking forward to reading the book. I feel like I've been looking forward to reading this book for a long time. I apologize because I've been having computer problems in the Zoom session, and maybe you did discuss this, but I'm curious, in his survey of peoples and rebellions, if Marx wrote about the Taiping Rebellion. I know that Engels did, but I don't really know if Marx did. And if not, it seems like an omission, given that even if it wasn't directly provoked by the Opium Wars, it seems related to it, and it also seems like nestled in there between the 1848 revolutions and the Paris Commune. And I know a lot of people are dismissive of it, and maybe we should be. They did include things like land reform and so on. So, like, whether Marx wrote a lot about it or not, I wonder where you think it might fit in with some of the other places that you did talk about. And again, if you spoke about this in the last hour, I've been waiting to reboot my computer for about an hour. So, thank you.
I didn't speak about it, and the reason is that in his late writings, he doesn't return to China. But in the 1850s, there's a lot of discussion of this. At the time of the Taiping Rebellion, there are several articles that he wrote about it, and these are I discussed these in Marx at the Margins, my earlier book. And so, yeah, you mentioned the landed property. The Taiping Rebellion was, I don't believe Marx singles this out, but it was also known for women's rights as well. But over time, it became like much more hierarchical, much more despotic in terms of leadership. And so Marx actually has some very poignant passages about how, to a great extent, they destroyed themselves, which then prepared the way for the old regime, aided by European powers, to suppress them. But he regards it as a hugely important event. I mean, he writes maybe 5 or 6 short articles on it in the 1850s. But just more in general, Edward Said, the critic. Now there is that passage in the Communist Manifesto about the Chinese walls, but after that, and I'm not sure Marx was aware of the Taiping Rebellion at the time that he wrote the manifesto. I'd have to look that up again. But it's hardly anyone attacks Marx for what he wrote about China, the way they attack him for what he wrote on India, because Marx was almost always supportive of the Chinese in their resistance to colonialism, and calling the British barbarians and all this kind of language. He fell into this thing that was partly rooted in Hegel in his early writings in India, which is the idea of the passivity of Indian civilization. There's those lines like, well, they were always getting conquered and they kind of allowed themselves to be conquered. In his late writings, he discovers that that wasn't really the case, that there was tremendous resistance. It's where Alexander the Great got the wound that eventually killed him, for instance. So he no longer presents it as a passive civilization. But the Chinese, he never had that illusion of. As my mentor, Denny Ipskaya, once told me, just in a off-the-cuff remark, like, yeah, well, he really respected the Chinese because they never stopped fighting, always fighting and resisting, and kept that up the whole time. So, there are writings on China. There are not as many of them. There's certainly no discussion of like communal social formations in China or anything like that, in the way that he does in his late writing.
Yeah, thank you. So you're saying, which I knew, he saw it in the context of, even though he didn't use the word anti-imperialist struggle against England, but he didn't really see in the peasant uprisings the roots that he saw, say, in Russia.
Well, but he's aware that it's an anti-dynastic uprising. He doesn't think, the Taiping Rebellion was not directed against foreign colonialism, which wasn't really that significant in China yet.
Mm.
Uh, it was directed against the monarchy and the political the Chinese political system. He's aware of it as a social, having some aspects of a social revolution, but he doesn't see it as connected to like modern communism. He doesn't make
Okay. Thank you.
Jim Henley, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for this talk. It's wonderful. And I've read your Marx at the Margins, and I'm looking forward to the new book. And I just had a question about your own thinking. You emphasize so much about how Marx was actively and creatively reacting to the developments in capitalism that he saw in his time, and that his views evolved accordingly. I wonder if you have felt a similar kind of evolution in your own thinking, so that you found some differences in the new book from the conclusions that you drew in the earlier one. Thanks.
Oh, what am I thinking about Marx evolved rather than my thinking in general?
Either one, either one.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the time I finished Marx at the Margins, I was viewing these communal social formations as more, something of the past that showed us the creativity of Marx's thinking and the need for us to think very creatively about various forces of opposition and revolution and creativity and opposing the system. I would say that, and you can find that in the concluding pages of Marx at the Margins. In the new book, I think I'm adopting more the attitude that remnants of these kinds of social arrangements continue even after they've been subsumed, if you will, under capitalism. I didn't use it in the new book explicitly, but the notion of formal versus real subsumption of labor power under capital. Some people are familiar with that. It's a different thing. As in Ireland under British colonialism, the market relations and other aspects of capitalism are coming into the furthest village in the West Country of Ireland. But the social relations in the village are not completely capitalist yet, in the way they are in New York or Manchester. And even there, because, it's just since writing Marx at the Margins, for some reason I got thinking about this classic of sociology from about 1972 called All Our Kin. People have heard of this book, but it's an ethnographic study of a black community in a small city in Illinois. And it's about how people share their economic resources. If someone inherits a little bit of money, for example, that they would share it among their neighbors and friends because this was their insurance for the future. It was like, pay it forward, so to speak, because then these are the people, this small little thing you got is going to run out. These neighbors are the ones you're going to have to rely on when something happens. So that's a form of communism. The author was a standard liberal sociologist, certainly didn't use the word communism. So, I think some aspects or remnants of these kinds of social relationships are all around us. And of course, we can see it in places like Bolivia. I hadn't thought of it in Palestine, but then Linebaugh published this article, and then I went and looked more deeply at what Marx himself was writing, because obviously the Romans had destroyed the traditional clan or tribal structure of North Africa and introduced Roman-style private property 2,000 years ago, or more than 2,000 years ago. But things can be revived and so on. And so apparently as the Arabs came through, they brought with them a somewhat communal system of governance. And that's what has taken root in parts of North Africa, certainly. And there's plenty of sociologists who talk about the clans and tribes, and that you can't understand, say, Morocco without understanding that. So this stuff is around more than is often recognized, and so I think that's a big change. And really, the two books are much more of a continuity. This was the book I wanted to write 30 years ago when I started writing Marx at the Margins. But I said, I'm going to do like one chapter on this stuff before the late Marx. But that became 5 chapters on the Civil War in the United States, the Irish thing, India, China, changes in capital in the Grundrisse, and so on. And so then only a 6th chapter on the late Marx. So this is like an expansion of and a development of what was just one chapter. A lot of people don't realize that because most of the reviews of Marx at the Margins focused just on that last chapter, which had the newest stuff, in the sense it was writing about material that people were not aware of. You didn't ask this, but I should have mentioned this, and it's related. These have everything I referred to in my book has now been published. Volume 427 of the Marx Engels Gesamthaus has now been published in Mega Digital. It's actually an online publication. And I don't know if Charles Wrights is still. Charlie, are you still here? No. Charlie left, but Charlie and I and David Smith, we're coming out with an edition of some of these late writings, including the writings on Rome that I was quoting, which have never been published until last year in any language. That's going to be coming out in the next few years. When we have the translation, we're just like working on it. And Charlie is plugging away on that as we speak, I think.
Great.
Okay, we do have time for 1 or 2 more questions before Kevin has to leave us at 3:30 or at 30 after the hour. Anyone else? Okay, well, by all means, acquire and read this book, and maybe we'll have Kevin back in a few months and discuss it further, or do a reading group or something of that sort. Yes, Kevin.
Fred, we had the discount. If you go to the website.
Yes, I'm sorry. There is a discount code. What is it? I'll put it in the chat.
I think it just says late Marx, one word.
Mm-hmm.
Go to Verso's webpage. You can get a 40% discount until the end of the month.
Yes, I just put that in the chat. So yes, by all means, take advantage of that offer. And Kevin, anything else you'd like to add, or you'd like to tell us where you're off to at 3:30 or 12:30 where you are?
Well, yeah, because it's still, we start things late in LA anyway. So the 2 p.m. is the Palestine demonstration. That's about 90 minutes from now. So right. I wanted time to get to that in downtown LA.
Saul Thomas, do you have something quick to add here before we
conclude?
Yes.
Sorry, sorry, I haven't read Professor Anderson's earlier book that mentions Lenin, but I was wondering if you could say a few words about how to interpret Lenin in light of what you've just been talking about. His relation to Vera Zasulich and then the state, etc. Okay, thanks very much.
Yeah, I have an article on Lenin, Crisis and Critique. It's an online journal. It just came out a couple months ago. Because the last year was the Lenin centenary. There were a bunch of comments, and I was talking a lot about it. Yeah, I think we have to view. Lenin certainly took up the Irish stuff. He actually writes about it explicitly because he has a lot of writings about national self-determination and national liberation, and so he based himself in part in that. But of course, Lenin took it further. It was a more developed historical period where there were real gigantic anti-colonial movements beginning in places like China and India. and that did have or were about to have socialists in their leadership in some cases. So, Lenin is really the pioneer in 20th century Marxism in terms of looking at that. And in the essay I published, that a lot of people love George Lukács, and I do too. And he and Kors single out this thing from Lenin that we have to be materialist friends of the Hegelian dialectic, because they want to find, support for the idea, which I agree with, that Marxists need to deal directly with Hegel. That so they found this essay because this is before Lenin's philosophic notebooks were published. So Lukács quotes that, but as I bring out in my article, Lukács quotes that as a sentence. He doesn't quote the paragraph. He quoted the paragraph. If you read on, you find this is because the Western Marxists don't understand that the new revolutions are going to be coming from Asia, that we have to be dialectical and flexible and creative in the way that we look at things to grasp this, and not just think that the German model of how to build a socialist party is going to be the model for the rest of the world. Therefore, we have to become materialist friends of the Hegelian dialectic. So for Lenin, anyway, which it sounds crazy to a lot of people, because who could be more European than Hegel? And some of what Hegel writes about non-Europe is terrible. But Lenin thinks that dialectical framework will be really important in terms of conceptualizing that. And of course, we could trace that forward to people like Frantz Fanon, who were critical, but also were using Hegel and that tradition. I come out of with C.L.R. James, Ryevenievskaya, those people too. So that's one similarity between Lenin and Marx, but Lenin's writings are kind of abstract in the sense that when Lenin writes a book on imperialism, he's talking about finance, capital, and all the global forces. What Lenin does is a little bit similar to part of what Rosa Luxemburg does in Accumulation of Capital, although Luxemburg has different conclusions and is not supportive of national liberation, let alone independence women. But if you read the parts of Accumulation of Capital on India, for example, Luxemburg also drills down and looks at the direct village level impact of colonialism and imperialism on these societies. Lenin doesn't actually do that for whatever reason. So that's because I think it's very important to look very empirically and sociologically at what's actually going on in various societies, because otherwise we can too easily fall into these things like, we can miss some of the variety of world societies and civilizations.
Okay, thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks, Kevin, again for your talk and explications. And we all look forward to reading the book.
Thank you very much,
Thanks again.
everyone else.